So I've been working with my WAZER for the better part of a year now, and I get the same questions all the time. What kind of maintenance does it need, and is it something a beginner can use? The WAZER website does have a lot of resources, and the more I read about it before I started working with it, the more I chilled out and played with it. And now that I've run into basically every scenario and maintenance need that it has, I'm ready to talk about it. So first of all, there's maintenance that you're supposed to regularly do, and then maintenance that you have to do when you don't do the regular maintenance. And I'm especially good at finding out what happens when I get lazy about the routine stuff. For example, these are the grit collection baskets. As the WAZER cuts, it feeds water and grit out of the grit hopper into a jet that cuts the material. The grit then sinks through the cut bed into the tank and gets sucked up and deposited into the baskets. After each cutting, or before, either really, or both, the machine actually gives you a readout reminder. You're supposed to empty these baskets out so the machine doesn't get stuffed up with grit. But I occasionally just skip that if they don't seem full, and then over time my tank gets a buildup of grit in the bottom and I have to take out the cut bed and scoop all the grit out. So that's kind of fun. There's actually another WAZER process that falls into this area. There's a tank clean cycle you're supposed to run routinely to disturb any accumulated grit sitting on the floor of the tank and allow it to be sucked up and extracted by the collection baskets. And I do run this cycle for the most part at the end of a cutting session. But I occasionally just forget that. And then over time, my tank gets a buildup of grit in the bottom and I have to take out the cut bed and scoop all the grit out. And while there's an expectation of doing this from time to time with the WAZER, like you're not expected to just never have to empty the tank, I'm fairly certain that with mine, I'm doing and not doing the right precautions to prevent it from happening a lot more than it is. And the next routine thing you need to do is open the back of the tank and pull out these magnetic filters. They're actually super easy to remove, and they're basically just a fine mesh that seems to prevent any of the dusty debris from cutting residue to getting into the pump system. They're also really easy to clean. They just come apart, and then aside from scrubbing the strong magnet, they're pretty much just a rinse out situation. And I would say I was doing this regularly enough. However, I recently ran into an issue where the entire WAZER wouldn't turn on due to a pump problem that was likely caused by my neglect here because they were almost entirely black when I pulled them out. Unfortunately, these impeller things installed behind the WAZER as part of the connection between the tank and the pump on the ground down here stopped functioning, and I needed to replace them. And after I got that part and installed it, the machine worked perfectly. So I could be better. And this issue was actually really fun to troubleshoot because I got to detach my pump hose and shoot water through everything and give it a good clean out. Finally, the most common maintenance issue I've had to contend with is clogs in my grit line. There's this one small rubber tube that runs here from the bottom of the grit hopper through the machine and feeds it into the cutting head to mix with water. The grit the WAZER uses is this super fine, super soft garnet grit that I get in these 50-pound bags, and it turns out it really needs to be this fine in order for the WAZER to suction it through the grit line. Because whenever I leave the lid off my grit bucket and then drip water into the grit and then ignore it and scoop it into the hopper anyway, it clogs the grit line. This is pretty easy to sort out though. Usually I just reach up underneath and thread a thin piece of wire up into the line and clear out the wet grit and then problem solved. It's a little bit finicky, but doesn't take me very long. If the clog is at the other end, I just remove the line from the cutter head and clear the grit out that way. And then, just to make sure I am a true expert in clearing clogged grit lines, I occasionally start running my WAZER after forgetting to turn the water on. And of course, ignoring the reminder to turn the water on that shows up every time you go to run it. And since these clogs are a little worse, I get to have the fun of using my air compressor to force the grit out of the line. Anyway, that's really all I've come across over the last year of working with my WAZER. All pretty easy to deal with, and all pretty preventable if I were a little bit more gentle with things and I performed the routine checks of the equipment that I'm supposed to. As it's only been 9 months, I'm sure I'll come across other issues to deal with eventually, but that's fairly standard for any kind of shop equipment. For instance, look at the thermal coil in my kiln. It's not supposed to be where it is. Thanks for watching my video on how to abuse or maintain a WAZER water jet. Hopefully this answers any questions that you have about the maintenance, and hopefully it answers the question if a beginner can operate this machine properly. Or, drop any comments you have.